Hi everyone, welcome back to Grief in the Workplace. This is part 2, how to support your team members. I'm still me, it's Dr. Brenda Marshall, and as I mentioned in part 1, this topic is really of personal, academic, and professional interest for me, so it's really great to have an opportunity to share some of these ideas with you. Here in part 2, we're going to build on the knowledge from part 1. And now we're going to look more concretely at some of the ways you can support a colleague, or if you're a leader in an organization, some things that you can do to help your team to be some more supportive of a colleague. So let's go. So we started with that true or false quiz. And now we're going to have a look at it one more time. And I'm going to suggest again, push pause, have a look at these statements, and decide, have you changed your mind based on some of what we learned in part 1? So take a few minutes to do that, and then I'll see you back. So coming back to the Model E's, we were focused on education as being a really terrific way to help organizations get the skills they need to have their people help others. So I'm going to continue with a few more components of the education piece, and then we're going to move into the accommodate, support, and empathy pieces. So what are the signs and expressions of grief? And you'll notice that I'm calling them signs and expressions. I'm not calling them symptoms because, again, grief is not an illness. It's a normal reaction to loss. So it's very normal for people to have signs and expressions across all 4 of these domains: physical, emotional, social, and cognitive. It's not unusual for people who are grieving to be experiencing sleep troubles. And I don't know about you, but I know when I don't get enough sleep, I tend to be a little cranky. And so now you're going to have someone in the workplace who is not only grieving, but they're also just very, very tired. People will say things like that grieving is exhausting, that they feel fatigued all the time. You might hear people sighing, and it's interesting. They don't even realize that they're doing it, but these are all physical signs of grief. Of course, there's the emotional component. You can have people who find the world very meaningless and just struggle with what does it all mean, and how do I go on? The social side can sometimes show up at work because people may avoid interactions with others, and they could come across as being withdrawn. Not everyone. So again, I have to keep going back to grief is such an individual experience. These are just some things you may see, and they can be helpful if you understand what's driving it. Now, what's interesting is it used to be people were coming back to a physical workplace. And now that we're in the pandemic, you're really coming back to a virtual workplace. And it's going to be interesting to see how that helps and how that hinders grief, because someone may have found that even though it was difficult at times to go into their physical workspace, it was a place to have some distance from how they were feeling, because they could distract themselves and feel a little bit normal, even just for a snapshot moment in the day. The piece that I find can be most interesting and helpful for others at work to understand is it's not unusual when you're grieving to have some cognitive impacts. And I find this is what really makes people the most nervous. They may find that they're forgetful, or they have slowed thinking, trouble focusing. I had someone I worked with who said it would take him hours to try and craft an email. So one of the things that can happen is, because you're grieving and you're having maybe some of these cognitive challenges, people feel frightened that, oh my gosh, I'm not coping very well at work. What if I lose my job too? Then I will have all these losses. And so the extent to which you can normalize some of this for people and make it easy and okay for them to talk about it and acknowledge it can really help someone. So that's why sometimes understanding some of this can help you to be a better colleague and a better leader. This is a really interesting graph. It was based on some surveys with individuals who were grieving where they were asked to rate their own level of functioning, and they were looking at it in terms of how much time had passed since the loss. So if you're looking at the bottom, this is the time frame here. So how would they rate their functioning when it was within just the first 2 weeks of loss? And you can see that someone would say, well, I was actually functioning pretty well. And then what you see is the functioning dropping off. And here, right around 6 months, you can see someone is really now finding that they're really starting to struggle. So what's interesting from a workplace perspective is to understand what could be going on that could create this, where someone finds that they are not functioning as well as they were at the beginning. So in the beginning, there's so much to do. You have to organize a funeral. You have to hold yourself together for the events. You probably have lots of people coming to visit. People are dropping things off for you. And in a lot of ways, you're in a coping mode where you're just doing things. The other thing is that in that first initial time period, this is where people at work maybe see you. If they come to the funeral, they'll see you, and then later when they're chatting, they might say, well, how did Brenda seem like she was doing? And everyone will say, well, she seemed like she was doing really well. Now, after the first 2 weeks, lots of times your visits start to dry up, and also more reality of what's happened. You start to understand on deeper levels what's been lost, and it starts to sink in. So it is not unusual as time goes on for someone to find that they're finding it actually harder to cope. Again, perfectly normal, and this isn't true for everyone. The other thing is that maybe if you were in a dual parent household and now you're a single parent, you all of a sudden now are doing all the pickups and drop-offs for the children, and just the weight of responsibility can be heavy. So I've actually been called in to assist people right around the 6 months part where people at work are saying, well, why hasn't this person bounced back yet? And so all this to say that, again, grief is an individual experience, but to see a curve like this would not be unusual. So if we're just coming back to the model, and now we go to accommodate, what I'm going to talk about here is less about what you ought to do from a legal perspective, but more so what are some simple things you can do just from a human perspective to help someone who. So I like to think of it in terms of 3 circles: connect, collaborate, and communicate. And I'll just say a few things about each of those. So one of the ways you can connect with someone, and this is really great if the leader can do this, is to connect with that individual before they're coming back to work and just have a conversation where certainly you're acknowledging the loss, but you're also trying to explore with the person what would help them feel most comfortable when they come back to work. So what are they comfortable with you sharing with the team? And you may want to suggest a few things. And in terms of suggesting, you're just asking, would this be helpful if? Would it be helpful for you if you were to visit the office before your official start date and just say hi to people? So someone that I know experienced a traumatic loss, and they found it most helpful to actually go to work before they were officially supposed to be back, so that then they could go around and talk to people. And what this person said to me was they wanted to just get it over with. And so that helped them when they came back on their first day to focus. Sometimes just saying, would you like to walk in with someone, can be helpful. There's something about that threshold of walking in from the parking lot into your office, and when you left your office, your life was so different, and now you're back, and it can really create some shakiness for people. And so if you just have someone with you, you've got someone there in case someone wants to come up and talk to you and maybe they haven't seen you and they think maybe you've just been on vacation. Now, I'm telling you this in terms of a physical office that you're coming back to. And again, I think in the midst of COVID, we're going to have to adapt this a little bit because you may be coming back to a virtual office. So you can still follow the same principles of asking someone, what would be most helpful. But now thinking through, okay, what is it like for that person to be suddenly on a giant Skype call? What would be most comfortable for them in terms of that? Do they want anyone to say anything to them? You can also encourage the individual to send a note out to their colleagues in terms of what they need. So I am aware of someone whose loved one died and it was part of a crime. And so they actually couldn't talk about what happened and they didn't want to. So they just sent a note to all their colleagues and said, I really appreciate everyone's concern. When I come back to work, I would just prefer to focus on work and not talk about this at all. The other thing you can do is create and practice a script with someone. So someone I worked with didn't really want people inquiring as to how their children were doing with the death of their mother. That was this individual's spouse. And so the way he chose to handle it was to just say, when someone would say, how are your kids doing? He could say, we're just doing the best we can. Thank you for asking. And then he wanted to just move right into the business that they needed to talk about. So that really worked for him. As a leader, making comments like, if you need to just go home, just go. You don't have to ask. It just gives the person the freedom to know if they're having a rough go that day that they have that ability to leave. I'll bet you that most people will not leave, but just knowing that they could can help them. And same thing for your Skype calls that you maybe have to do now because of the pandemic. If they need to hop off the call, just hop off. And I know two people have done this last element, bring a friend. And I think, geez, brilliant workplaces for suggesting this. There was an individual whose son died in a car crash, and his employer invited him to have a friend come in with him as much as he wanted. So his best friend set up shop in the office next to him for a full week when he came back to work. And he found that so helpful. Someone else I know had their sister come in with them. So if you can do this in the context of your workplace, this could be very helpful for people. So these are ideas. They don't cost you anything. They're very easy to implement, and they can have a tremendous impact on helping someone feel supported. The individual is coming back to a team, and your team may be worrying about a few things. They want to know, what can I expect? How can I be helpful? And then also, they could be triggered or dealing with their own losses, especially now in terms of COVID, with so many people grieving all kinds of losses. So when you can bring the team together and just create space for a conversation about this, it helps everyone feel better equipped to talk to the person when they come back. And then we come back to this cartoon, which I showed in the first half. This helps everyone to feel more comfortable that they can say or do something that's going to be helpful for the individual. And if there's one thing I could suggest that is pretty consistent amongst everyone who I've ever talked to who's grieving, is to have some kind of acknowledgement for their loss. Unless they specifically say no, they don't want that, for most people, they notice when someone doesn't say anything. So even just I'm so sorry, that's a simple gesture, but it acknowledges that you know that they are experiencing something very difficult. So coming back to this idea of connecting, collaborating, and communicating. So for a leader, you're taking the lead role in connecting with the individual who's grieving before they even come back to work. You're collaborating on some ideas to help that first day back go okay. And then you're communicating with the team. And I also wanted to stress that I think a great practice is to continue to meet with the individual every week. And at the close of every week, just say, what's going okay, what's harder, and what can we do to make things better for you at work? And if you keep up that relationship, that gives that person space to say, you know what, I'm having a really hard time taking customer complaint calls right now, or I'm having some trouble concentrating. And then you can collaborate with them, you can work with them to figure out, okay, do we need to move those functions off to someone else right now? Or maybe we can give you, the more tedious parts of your job can occur during the parts of the day where you're lower energy. These are all things you can do to help someone. What you're trying to do is find a way to invite them in so that they have a place where they can feel connected, that they're doing something that's a little bit like what they used to do. So there's a sense of some sense of normalcy at some point in the day for them. Coming back to the ease model, we've talked about education, we've talked about accommodate. I'm going to talk about support now. And the support I'm thinking of is support for the support system of individuals around someone at work. A really interesting dynamic that can sometimes pop up in the workplace is this idea of a gatekeeper. So let's suppose that I'm the person who's grieving. I'm that person inside the office there. And I'm particularly close with perhaps my executive assistant. And so people start coming to my executive assistant and saying, is this a good day to talk to Brenda? Or do you think Brenda would make this decision on this plan? And so that my executive assistant feels like she's doing a good thing, that she's protecting me. And this is a normal thing that can crop up. There's nothing wrong with it, and there's all good intentions. But at the end of the day, Brenda, I'm the leader, and I don't want to learn that other people are going around me. I would rather they come and talk to me, and I then have the freedom to say, you know what, today's not a good day for this. And so this is just a dynamic to be mindful of. If it happens, you can just talk to everybody about it. And certainly when I was working at an organization where this very dynamic came about, just by talking to everybody involved, we were able to come to some different resolution around how to handle it. And the leader was so appreciative to know that people were nervous about coming to talk to her, because then she was able to step forward and talk to her team and say, you know what, you don't need to be worried about this. Come and see me. If I'm having a bad day, I'll let you know, but please don't be afraid. I want to do my job. I get personal satisfaction from it. So please don't be afraid. And so it was a really good, positive resolution to this. I'm just going to pause here and let you look at the heading of this article. So what happened in this situation was a mother had a child who was very ill for a long time, and the child then died. And the mom kept the child's ballet slippers on her desk. Her colleagues around her had been a great source of support to her throughout her child's illness and then after the child died, but they were becoming really exhausted with what to say and do. And so they went to their boss and said, we need this person to stop talking about this. We've done everything that we can. And so the boss called the individual in, had a conversation about this, and then the individual became upset, left the office, and subsequently was fired from their job for abandoning their job. And, we don't know all the details of what happened here, but you can look and say there was a lot of pieces of this puzzle that maybe could have been handled differently. And certainly one of them would have been to check in with the individuals around this person and see how they were coping with just listening to their colleague talk about their loss. Sometimes that's all it takes, is to just check in and say, how are you doing with all of this? And then that person feels supported and they are re-energized that they can help continue to support their colleague. So the last part of our model is empathy. What does empathy at work look like? I think of empathy at work as being there for the long term. So beyond your first few days, few weeks, few months, it's being able to recognize that there's going to be days that are difficult for this individual for a long time, and maybe even for forever. Someone I know whose child died said that the human resources manager came to see them every year right around Mother's Day just to say, how are you managing? What have you got planned for the weekend? And even though that HR manager couldn't say or do anything that would make the individual feel better, the fact that they remembered and demonstrated care and concern for them just meant so much to them. And I've heard stories like this from many people. So being thoughtful about the ways you can provide empathy for someone can really go a long way. And it could even be thinking through, a holiday party. If someone is recently grieving, do they want to be in the receiving line? And just giving them the choice. Thinking through, is that going to be too much for them? But asking them, what would you like to do? And I think of an individual that I worked with who was supposed to be in the receiving line for the holiday party, and he was really nervous that he might get overwhelmed or get overly upset. And so we talked about some strategies for him. And one of them was to just have one of his colleagues who he was close to stand next to him. And if he found himself getting upset, he could step out of the line. His friend could step in for him. He could gather himself and step back in. He wanted to be in the receiving line, but just giving him some ways to think about how he could do it in case he ran into some troubles made such a big difference for him. So that's what I think about when I think of empathy in the long term. It's just helping the individual think through things that are coming and providing a space where they can talk to you and brainstorm how to make it possible if that's what they'd like to do. That concludes our two-part series. And just coming back to what the initial objectives and hopes were, that anyone watching these would have increased knowledge about grief and loss and understand some of the unique losses that are present because of the pandemic, how to explain what normal reactions to loss are, and hopefully the gist you've taken from both these presentations is that loss is a very individual experience, and pretty well everything is a normal reaction to loss. And how do you actually support team members? Connect, collaborate, and communicate is a great framework to think about, and this will go a long way to helping someone reintegrate back into the workplace and feel like they're supported in doing so. Here we are at the end of our two-part presentation, and I just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody for caring and wanting to learn more about this topic. I love this picture because I feel like this is really something that can happen, and all of us are in a great position to be helpful to someone, and you can make such a difference for them with just some really small gestures. So thank you so much. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I've got my email there on the slide, and it would be lovely to hear from you. Thank you. Have a great day.